This All right. Well, thank you for everybody that's tuning in online. Today we are here with Ann Fulton from ProAnimalFuture, and she's going to be giving a presentation today on the impact of your diet, the environmental impact of your diet. So normally we would give a check-in question, but I'm going to give an check-in question this time. So if you want to type in the comments below, what would you say is the most climate-friendly food that you regularly eat? Um, it could be anything. So go ahead and drop that in. I'll give you a few seconds. That's enough time. And I will pass it over to Ann here to, yeah, give a quick presentation. And after that, we'll have a little bit of an FAQ back and forth. And if you have questions after the fact, feel free to drop them in the chat below and we will respond to those. So, yeah, take it away, Ann. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Happy to be here, and I'll go ahead and get my screen sharing started. All right, can you see the full screen version?
Yep, it's perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you all tonight. Yeah, I'm excited to get more involved with 350 Colorado. You guys have been doing amazing work, and I've gotten to collaborate a little bit with Heidi and Matt a little bit this year. Got to testify for a couple of the climate bills that y'all are supporting, and yeah, can't wait for what's in the future. But to quickly introduce myself, my name's Ann Fulton, and I am the Colorado campaign director for Pro Animal Future, or you might hear us refer to ourselves as Pro Animal Colorado. They're essentially interchangeable. We're like the Colorado chapter since we're looking into potentially spreading out beyond Colorado. We're hoping that we can be maybe like 350 someday. Big shoes to fill there. But
Love that.
anyway, I'll be talking this evening about the environmental impacts of our diets and even more broadly, the environmental and climate impacts of agriculture and how that really plays a big part into our current climate crisis, current climate situation, and how it's really, a lot of the focus gets put on oil and gas, but there are a lot more pieces to the puzzle. So just want to start with a quick quote here that appeared in National Geographic not too long ago. It says, "When we think about threats to the environment, we tend to picture cars and smokestacks, not dinner. But the truth is, our need for food poses one of the biggest dangers to the planet." And if you're, trying to quantify that, one great example is that together, the world's top five meat and dairy corporations are now responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than ExxonMobil, Shell, or BP on their own, which is kind of mind-boggling to think. And here's a graphic that really shows that. So the top producers in the animal agriculture industry are JBS, which is based in Brazil, I believe, but they have uh, large farming operations all over the world, many of which are in the US, including here in Colorado. A lot of if you're ever drive through Greeley, a lot of those like cattle feedlots up there, many of them are owned by JBS or contracted by JBS. There's also Tyson Food, which probably everybody's heard of. If you go to the frozen foods food section, you see Tyson chicken nuggets, Tyson chicken breasts, all that stuff. Tyson is big player as well. And then there's also Cargill. So those three are the big three. And then there's also Dairy Farmers of America and Fonterra. And yeah, you can see in looking at the GHG emissions that all those top five equate the emissions that a huge company like ExxonMobil is pushing out. So yeah, it's not just a tiny fraction of the emissions. Animal agriculture is really a lot more than people really realize. And here's another great visual to show you. It's kind of like an iceberg. This one's definitely not to scale because we all know icebergs are much larger under the water, but right now most Americans have a pretty rosy view of the food system because we only see a very small part of it. And that's the part of the iceberg that's above the waterline. And which in the case of food involves our individual food and water consumption and food waste. Both of those, of course, are very large factors. However, food starts at like Yeah, food starts at the grocery store or restaurant, and that's how we typically think about it. But meat corporations don't want us to think about what lies below the waterline on this metaphorical iceberg. And that's all the resources that are required to feed the 10 billion, say that again, 10 billion animals raised for food every year, and all of the deforestation and water and air pollution caused by those animals and what it takes to feed and maintain those operations. And so most of those impacts are coming from what you hear termed as factory farming. And that's exactly what it sounds like. Those are these really large scale farming operations that are mostly owned by those top five companies, mostly JBS, Tyson, and Cargill, either own or contract, which is essentially like uh, kind of the feudal system with a lot of local farmers there, contracted, but these big corporations still own basically everything. So they're kind of like indentured service servants a lot of the time. So it's not a yeah, it's a really hard life even for the smaller farmers that are connected to these larger corporations. But factory farming is connected to a lot of issues. So when we're like at Pro Animal Future, our main thing is we want to combat factory farming, which is very similar to wanting to combat climate change because factory farming is intricately linked with that and a lot of other things that we care a lot about. So, when people think about animal rights people or people going against factory farms, you might only think of us caring about the animal welfare, animal suffering part, but there's so much more connected to it. There's, like I've already started mentioning, the greenhouse gas emissions from farming operations. Also, a result of keeping a bunch of animals in very close quarters is you have a lot of potential for zoonotic disease transfer between animals and then between animals and workers and then into communities. So we saw that during COVID-19, and now we're seeing that with bird flu, especially in dairy operations. So another thing to think of. And then factory farming is also largely tied to deforestation, especially in the Amazon. There's a big piece of worker injustice, environmental pollution in addition to the gas emissions, and then chronic disease, both related to the environmental effects and then also just the health effects of these products. So, and then one more kind of, oop, I skipped a slide? Definition piece is you may also hear factory farms referred to as CAFOs, and that just refers to a concentrated animal feeding operation. And that's a USDA definition. It's essentially, yeah, these farms where you have thousands to hundreds of thousands of individual animals crammed into really small spaces for their whole lives. And it's essentially done to produce the most profit and product for the least amount of cost and space. So, all right. Now, how does that all connect to our environmental and climate impacts? So, animal agriculture produces almost the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as the entire transportation sector, and this is globally. So, I will, let's see where, yeah, I'll pose a question here to our lovely audience. Um, oh no, my notes disappeared for that one. Okay. Anyway, I'll just ask you, Matt, put you on the spot here. My notes for this slide disappeared somehow, so oh well. But
No worries.
yeah, how do you think it's possible that animal agriculture could possibly add up enough greenhouse gas emissions to match the transportation sector?
So I'm going to give a bit of a two-part answer here, but the first part that I'm going to say is obviously there are emissions of methane that I'm aware of is, a
Hmm.
lot more concentrated and stronger, I guess, if you want to use that word, than CO2 when it comes to a greenhouse gas. And then the other aspect of it is I know that a lot of these farms, there are some that are, or not farms, ranching operations, whatever you want to call them, mass operating things. Some of them have to be flown far distances. And so I would say that the transportation side of things might overlap with some of this as well. Um, but maybe everything that has to go into it. So
Yeah.
that's the short answer from me.
Yeah, you're pretty right on there. Yeah, pretty much every animal used in agriculture produces methane, especially ruminants like cows and sheep and goats, because they've got multiple stomachs and they're ruminating on the grass and chewing forever, and it's fermenting in their stomachs, so they're constantly burping out methane. A lot of people think it's cow farts that are causing all the emissions. It's actually mostly the burps. The burps way outshadow the farts. Very, very scientific and technical here, but it's true.
I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's funny.
And in addition to just like the methane that the animals are producing directly, there's also a huge amount of power input and then emissions from having to produce all the amount of feed crops that you need to sustain that many animals, hundreds of thousands of chickens in one giant barn or, thousands of cows on a feedlot. You need to feed them. And so I think it's something like 60% of all like plant crops grown in America, in the US, are for directly for feeding to livestock. And then that only leaves the rest for like, biofuels and then feeding humans. So yeah, it's
Sure.
crazy.
Wow.
A lot of resources going in. All right. And then, yeah. So according to the most recent data, this graph specifically sourced from Climate Watch. Transportation emits around 16% of the world's greenhouse gases. And if you add up the emissions from livestock and manure, soil, crop burning, deforestation, and energy in agriculture and fishing, most of which is directly connected to that factory farming, it all adds up to about 15.4%. So, yeah, that easily matches the transportation sector. And yeah, a lot of that's coming from methane, from burps and feces of the animals. And methane is 25 times worse for the climate. It's a lot more potent than carbon dioxide, even though it's shorter lived, but on scales that we care about, on the like decades to 50 years scale, it's awful. Yeah. You have to think generations into the future to get to where methane, naturally dissipates, but it's not, yeah, not to be taken lightly at all. So methane, in addition to being 25 times worse for the climate directly than carbon dioxide, accounts for 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, and nitrous oxide accounts for 24% and is actually up to, well, I believe 300 times worse for climate change than carbon
Wow.
dioxide. So what's coming out of cows is up to hundreds of times worse than what's coming out of our cars. So combine that with the fossil fuels required to grow the corn and soy that we feed directly to these animals, and factor in all the deforestation for land to, have them live on and graze, and meets huge carbon footprint starts to really make sense. So
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so like here, going back to this graph, you see greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein, and the number one offender is beef, and followed by dairy, poultry, eggs, etc. And you can see how much nicer for the environment, like your grains, your beans, your nuts are. And they tend to be more nutritionally dense. But looking up here at beef, a lot of people might think, okay, if we just eliminate beef from our diets and only eat chicken or something like that, isn't that good enough? Like, isn't that better? And because of the way cows' digestive systems work, they are the most polluting, they are the most largest emitters of the greenhouse gases. However, chicken only appears to be a more climate-friendly option when compared to bleh, cow products, but greenhouse gas emissions from a serving of poultry is still 11 times higher than from a serving of beans. And switching from beef to chicken is more like switching from a Hummer to an F-150, like
Yeah.
I have on this slide here, instead of like to a Prius or to a fully electric vehicle, which would be the equivalent maybe of beans. Yeah. So yeah, beef is definitely the worst offender. But, when you look at the scale, most animal products are still, or actually all animal products are still much, much higher in terms of their climate impact than their plant-based alternatives. So in addition just to greenhouse gases, there's a lot more to consider, including land use. Um, a lot of animal agriculture doesn't really like to advertise this, so a lot of people don't realize that meat production is actually the leading cause of the Amazon rainforest being cut down. And that's to make grazing land for beef cattle and land to grow soy and corn to feed those animals on factory farms. So, yeah, when you see images of people clear cutting the Amazon and burning it, a lot of people don't really connect that to, well, what are they burning all of this forest down for? What are they going to use it for? And a lot of time that's for grazing animals and yeah, producing animal agriculture. In addition to land use, there's also water use. So people also don't tend to realize that by just about every metric, animal products are more resource intensive and polluting than plant-based products. And in this figure here, you can see the emissions, land use, and water use associated with cow milk and other types of plant-based milks. Cow milk has the biggest environmental footprint in every category. Even when you're looking at water, where almonds tend to get a bad rap, and I suspect maybe a big dairy might be behind some of that. Those rumors going around about how, oh, if you eat almonds or drink almond milk, you're using so much water. But you can see that almond milk actually uses far less water than what it takes to produce cow milk. If you want the best overall, all around in terms of impact, I'd say go for oat milk or soy milk. And then in addition to water use, there's also major considerations for water pollution. And that's another below that metaphorical iceberg waterline impact of animal agriculture. And that's that those roughly 10 billion animals raised for food in the US every year produce huge amounts of waste, which then can pollute the air and water. And just as important as, thinking about the climate is thinking about the communities that this directly impacts. And the pollution directly coming from factory farms is a potent source of environmental racism because factory farms are almost always located near low-income communities of color. And factory farms, so frustratingly, are exempt from the Clean Air Act and other laws on the federal levels. So a lot of these laws are in place to protect communities and protect the environment, but because factory farms and most animal agriculture is exempt, they produce levels of air pollutants like ammonia and nitrous oxide up to 10 times greater than what would be legal for your average oil refinery. So to grasp the full effects on of the waste and health effects on communities surrounding factory farms, I would highly recommend everybody check out this amazing documentary that came out a few years ago called The Smell of Money. If you haven't seen that one yet, it really digs into like talking directly to the communities that are impacted by farming facilities in their communities and how there's so many more chronic illnesses and just like they do analyses of their water and it's pretty horrifying. But
And just for everybody watching, we'll link
yeah,
that in the description below.
awesome. Yeah, and I'll be sharing all of my slides with Matt, so he's yeah, feel free to distribute them to everybody. I've tried to put the sources for the information in the slides or in the notes, and then there's a slide at the end with more links and sources. So, all right. All right, we got another fun quote from the Eat Lancet report that says emissions must be halved by 2030 and net zero carbon emissions should be achieved by 2050. However, if all of these goals are achieved, but dietary patterns see no shifts, the world will fail to meet the Paris Agreement, which whew, that's kind of terrifying to think about. Yeah, increasingly, leading scientists and NGOs are taking note of the staggering environmental impacts of animal agriculture and urging us to take course. And this Eat Lancet report, as well as several other studies and peer-reviewed journals, have found that we just cannot keep climate change under control if we continue our diets on a global scale as usual. Even if every other sector, including energy, transportation, buildings, etc., became completely carbon neutral by 2050, but we left the food system completely unchanged, the food system alone would take us past that 1.5 degrees of warming by 2050. And yeah, just to back that up, in 2018, the renowned climate activist Paul Hawken came out with the book called Drawdown, and then the following project Drawdown that has continued from there that outlines the top 100 scientific solutions to drawing down carbon emissions. And since then, there's been at least one report directly updating this work that was published in 2018, and it all still stands. And amazingly, two of the top five recommended climate solutions in they went through two major scenarios, and in both scenarios, two of the top five relate directly to food. One of those is reducing food waste, which is huge because something like a third of all the food, both plant and animal based, that we produce globally never gets eaten. It just goes to waste, which is, again, horrifying to think about when you think about how many people there are in the world. And then the other one is transitioning to more plant-rich diets. And, that's not to say that everybody should just be vegan or be vegetarian. Even just minor changes to, rely less on animal agriculture make a huge difference for the climate. And these two plant-related climate solutions rank ahead on their own, ahead of solar, mass transit, and electric cars. So this is thinking about our food systems is really one of the most important actions we can take to combat climate change. All right, and just to back that up, that's why more and more people are looking towards plant-based meals, which on average have a carbon footprint that's 63% lower than animal-based meals. So even just transitioning to a few more plant-based meals every once in a while, or, a little change here and there really does make a tangible difference for the climate. And the graphic here on this slide lays out a study that examined different sustainability interventions for public events, such as like conferences or meetings. And they found that by far the most impactful intervention was switching from beef products to veggie burgers. Yeah, if you look, there's the kilograms CO2 equivalent savings per person or per 100-person event. And yeah, it's huge how much just taking beef out of the menu and putting in a veggie burger makes a difference. And then after that, the next most effective was just reducing the portion size of a beef option by 25%. And other interventions that we commonly think of as ways to go green, like using recycled plastic or eliminating single-use plastic, had actually virtually no impact on the carbon footprint of an event. I mean, of course, those things are important for other reasons, but the direct climate impact is basically zero. So when thinking, it's really where the food's coming from. That's the big thing in those kinds of events. All right, so some questions might come up when you're thinking about animal agriculture, like, oh, if factory farms are the problem, couldn't we just transition to entirely free-range livestock? Just make sure everything's grass-fed. And here you can see a real-world example from India. On the left side is a photo of what the land looked like. It's really small up there in 2002 with free-range cattle grazing. Their forest was turning into a desert and the soil was blowing away. It was really, yeah, a lot of soil erosion and, yeah, kind of getting drought conditions. And they consulted with scientists who advised them to stop grazing dairy cattle on the land. And in the photo on the right, you can see what the same plot of land looked like only 4 years later, once the cattle had been removed.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and you might also ask, like, is it better to have cows just roaming around when you're just thinking about the climate, maybe just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions? Is it better to have free range cattle versus, that factory farm confinement like we think of in Greeley? And ultimately, there's actually not a huge difference in environmental effects when considering free roaming versus factory farming. And grass-fed animals that are free roaming can actually produce around 50 to 60% more greenhouse gas emissions than cows can find on factory farms. And they can also use more water since their activity levels are higher, especially during the summer and warm climates. And unfortunately, from an animal welfare perspective, yes, having free roam, grass-fed animals is way better, but it's just not realistic because based on the current demand for animal products, there's just not enough available land. We would have to destroy millions more acres of wild areas and forests to accommodate all the animals we need to feed people at the current demand levels, unfortunately. Another question you might think of is, what about regenerative agriculture? And regenerative agriculture focuses on healthier soil and carbon sequestration through no-till farming, as well as crop rotations, keeping plants in the ground, fewer or no pesticides and herbicides, less water use, and then increasing biodiversity. And regenerative agriculture definitely holds a lot of promise, but the it's not quite there yet. And I'd love to see more work in that sector, but it's not just like a cure-all type of a thing because a lot of the science doesn't quite support all of the claims that they make. There are also no accepted standards for regenerative agriculture. And then one major concern is that large corporations can use the like regenerative terminology to really greenwash their practices. So need to be really careful there. And another issue is that although some regenerative farms don't use animals, others do use livestock, and that is kind of where it negates a lot of or yeah, kind of tamps down a lot of the benefits of regenerative agriculture. And that's because cows can release more methane and nitrous oxide than the soil can absorb. Because one of the main ideas is that you let the soil store, like, yeah, sequester and store that carbon. And unfortunately, if you have a bunch of cows on that land, you're going to reach the limit of what that soil can store a lot faster, and then you're eliminating the benefits from then on of reducing that carbon. And then similar with the idea of just having free-ranging animals, if we could move our whole food system to regenerative agriculture, that would solve a lot of climate problems, and that would be great. But there's just not enough land on the planet to raise enough regenerative animal products to meet the current demand. Yeah, the amount of land you need for regenerative is, yeah, like an order of magnitude more than you need on a factory farm. So it just doesn't scale, unfortunately. All right. So how does this all kind of tie us back and relate it to our issues with oil and gas? Well, the industries are a lot more similar than you might think. Um, there has been a long history of oil and gas trying to shift the blame of, their harms to the climate and their greenhouse gas emissions onto the consumer. For example, they kind of popularized the terminology for our carbon footprint and put a lot of that responsibility and blame onto the individual consumer, which, yeah, when you look at the scale of the large corporations, that's just absurd. And there's been a lot of work in recent years showing that big oil has just been on a campaign of lies and propaganda for decades, which is no surprise. And yeah, even the US government has been doing some inquiries, so we'll see. We'll see if anything more comes of that. But yeah, that shows that there have been these long-standing campaigns by oil and gas companies, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. Uh, their goals have been to question climate science and really block climate action, and then focus more on public relations and propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, rather than actually acknowledging that they're harming our planet and changing their practices. And all of that exact same stuff is happening with animal agriculture. So I'll just show you a few fairly recent headlines. This was from Inside Climate News. showing that the Farm Bureau and other groups like the National Cattlemen and Beef Association, all these groups are kind of the equivalent of the oil lobbies, the big oil groups. And this one says the Farm Bureau, big oil's unnoticed ally, fighting climate science and policy. Yeah, their interests go hand in hand, and they're both often lobbying and working to combat any climate positive policy because yeah, they're the big animal agriculture and oil and gas are, yep, they're doing the same thing, blaming the consumer when they're, yeah, when it's a lot larger, more systemic problem than that. But you might be interested to know that when you think of it on a proportional scale, large animal agriculture corporations are actually spending a larger percentage of their revenue on funding climate denialism and blocking climate legislation than big oil, which is kind of crazy to think about when you know, I'm sure you know how much big oil lobbies and fights against everything. Um, and yeah, let's see. So here's another headline that was a couple years later, showing up in pretty popular outlet at Vox, saying it's not just big oil, big meat also spends millions to crush good climate policy. And lots of peer-reviewed papers showing that there was early knowledge among the meat industry that they're really contributing to global warming, and their response, just like with big oil, was to spearhead a PR campaign rather than do something about it. Yeah, there's been more and more science coming out showing that, yeah, there's been so much work to obstruct our understanding of what's really affecting the climate. And one of the really scary things is that the agriculture industry has been able to kind of infiltrate universities, especially the big agriculture land grant universities, like CSU here in Colorado. There are several people there. I think there's one professor who's head of, oh, I forget what the department is, but it's essentially like the beef advocacy department for,
Yeah.
uh, I forget what the exact name of the department is, but she used to work for JBS, which is one of those big five, um, yeah, animal agriculture companies. And she was quoted saying that her day-to-day work working at Colorado State is basically the same as when she worked for JBS, which is a bad sign. Like if you're working for a big corporation and you're basically doing the same stuff working for a public university, yeah, there's something going wrong there. Yeah. And then the newest thing is that just at the beginning of this year, there have been some newly surfaced evidence that the beef industry has been essentially it's paralleling what's happened with oil and gas. They've been aware of the climate impacts since the 80s and have been actively working against actually letting anybody do anything about this climate, yeah, about their climate effects. Specifically, I think it was as early as 1989, the National Cattlemen's Association knew that cattle methane emissions contributed to climate change. But instead of cutting emissions, they drafted a 17-page plan to manage public perception through PR, influence legislation, and commission counter studies, like through those, plants and universities. And they really mirrored the fossil fuel industry's playbook to delay climate action. So I'll, yeah, that's I'll pretty much wrap up there and say that there are just so many connections between the fight against oil and gas and the fight against animal agriculture, and the effects of both of those giant corporate industries on our climate and on our planet and our ecosystems are huge. And yeah, I there's so much room for collaboration between groups against factory farming and groups against climate change, or groups, yeah, more climate focused groups. And I think, we're all working for essentially the same thing. And so I'm excited to get to know you all more in the future. And I would be happy to take any questions you have now. Or my email is on this last slide. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. You can also find ProAnimal Colorado on Instagram or find me. My Instagram is Ann for Animals. It's me with hanging out with a sheep is my main picture. But yeah, happy to chat more anytime.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, Anne, so much for this presentation. This was wonderful, and honestly, as somebody who's a pescatarian myself, it's changed my perception on really the fight behind it and the misinformation and the
Yeah.
PR campaigns is really what stuck with me there. And I guess yeah, also thank you to ProAnimal Future as well. I have about three questions for you, just maybe some
Yeah.
FAQ kind of things here, and then we'll wrap up a little bit early. But the first question I had was, do you and totally all right if you're not sure,
Mhm.
but with the seafood industry,
Yeah.
do you have any, I guess, insight on that and maybe where that kind of falls in the impact of these different, land-based,
Mhm.
meat products?
Yeah. So as somebody who grew up and lives in Colorado and am now working for a nonprofit in Colorado, we I haven't done as much research and haven't worked as much on fishing stuff because yeah, we don't have a big aquaculture
Yeah.
industry in Colorado. But I do know actually, it was the professor whose talk I went to at DU earlier today. Her name is Jennifer Jackett, and I can send you a link to her site with all of her info that we can share with everybody. But she's done a
Yeah.
lot of research on how the fishing industry and aquaculture and all of that affects the climate. And yeah, I don't have a
Yeah.
super great grasp on it. I know it is a huge issue. And like one of the things is like biodiversity. There are not enough regulations on what what is defined as overfishing and like how much of a certain species you're allowed to leave behind to
Yeah.
recover. Yeah, so there are definitely a lot of ecosystem and climate concerns with fishing, and I'd be happy to point you towards some more resources.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and everything that we're talking about and we're referring to is just going to be linked below. So we'll have little headlines. You guys can click on all of them and explore them for yourselves as well. Um, but yeah, thanks. And then the second question I had here was, there's got to be, and I think you maybe briefly touched on it in here earlier, but there's
Mm,
a lot of with really anything you buy, but also with meat products
mm.
styrofoam and plastic. It's always packaged in styrofoam and
Oh,
plastic.
yep.
And, that I think has to count for something. And, obviously it's, probably not easy to quantify as far as like emissions are concerned. But as far as
Mm.
pollution and waste,
Oh,
yeah, I
yeah.
guess maybe less of a question and more of a comment.
Oh yeah, I agree completely. It's horrifying to see all of the styrofoam and plastic wrap in every deli meat section of any store. It like aside from thinking about like, oh, what was the impact of all of this meat that's here and how much of that's going to go to waste? Just like all the plastic that's involved in that too. Yeah, it would be really interesting. I wonder if that would be a cool angle to try is to yeah, maybe approach the animal agriculture industry and say like you have to only use sustainable products to package your products. That would be a really interesting way to legislate that or something because I'm sure they use the styrofoam and plastic because it is the cheapest, most readily available thing. And another thing that I didn't even get to touch on is how incredibly heavily subsidized animal agriculture is by the government.
Yeah,
And that's why, people might say like, oh, well, plant-based options are so much more expensive. And well, that's if you're thinking about like the meat imitation products. But like
yeah,
most plant-based options are things everybody's already eating anyway, like beans and vegetables and yeah, nuts, etc. But yeah, the reason that animal products by comparison seem so cheap is that most of them are so heavily subsidized that without those subsidies, like a gallon of milk would be like 10 or $12 instead of like $2 or $3. So, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and that's a really great point. I'm glad you touched on that. That was going to be my next question there, so
Oh,
you
nice.
crushed that. So I'm gonna
Excellent.
pivot, and my last question for you instead is going to be the one thing that you're saying, and that what I think the science is saying that you can do to
Mhm.
reduce your environmental impact most rapidly,
Mhm.
above getting an EV, above anything else, is really changing what you consume. If
Yeah.
there was, one
Mhm.
thing that you feel like out of everything, like if we're talking about, switching to maybe a plant-based diet is maybe the best thing you can do. But
Mhm.
is if you were to give a recommendation on, what somebody who's been consistent meat eater in their life, and totally all right if not, but if
Yeah.
someone who's been a consistent meat eater their whole life, if maybe they were to decide maybe one day they're going to decide to not eat as much, they're not going to eat beef, they're not going to eat
Hmm.
chicken, they're not going to eat any kind of animal product. What do you think is a good substitute there? And I guess a follow up question with that, you know, a lot of these different this is something we also didn't touch on. A lot of these different animal products have been linked to heart disease, amongst other things. Um, how do you guys feel about that? And I know that's a
Mhm.
very long-winded question, but
Oh,
just
no
really your
worries.
thoughts on that, and we'll kind of close it out after that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like here, let me scroll back a little bit to one of the slides. Yeah, I think this slide is just so, wait, am I still screen sharing? Yeah,
Yep, you're
okay.
still screen sharing. You're good.
Excellent. Yeah, this slide is so striking that, like, if you're thinking just from an environmental perspective, just cutting down on like one thing like beef, and lamb also has a similarly high climate impact. Yeah, just cutting down a little bit on, if you don't want to give up any other kind of meat, like, yeah, just cutting down on your beef or lamb intake is still going to be really good for the environment. But all right, let me hit the different parts of your question there. I'll start with the I'll start with the second part of the question on the health effects. And actually, yeah, before really getting into animal advocacy stuff, I was kind of on and off vegetarian for a large portion of my life, starting in actually second grade. And the reason that I wanted to stop eating animals wasn't it actually had nothing to do with animal welfare or with climate. It was because my dad got colon cancer and like just watching him go through that and how terrifying that was and how much pain he was in, everything, and hearing directly from his doctors that he needed to stop eating red meat and like that was a huge contributing factor. And yeah, that really, really stuck with me. And of course, my dad went right back to eating red meat, after not too long and still does. But yeah, that stuck with my like second grader brain. And, I really, really then connected that later to climate and to animal welfare. And yeah, I think I pretty much stopped eating red meat at that point in second grade, seeing my dad go through colon cancer. And then, yeah, eventually moved to eating no animal products at all now. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's really scary when you look at how much of an effect, yeah, eating a ton of animal products can have on your cardiovascular and yeah, digestive system, especially yeah, linked to colon cancer and heart issues. And even just reducing your amount of input or intake can make a really positive difference too, as well as of course, like eat your 3 servings of veggies and leafy greens every day and all that stuff. But thinking about, yeah, how to best replace meat in your diet, one really common misconception among people, especially in the US for some reason, is this obsession with protein. And like people think like, oh, vegans don't get enough protein. You have to like, humans are meant to eat animals and, there's a lot of like there are a lot of anthropologists doing stuff about like, oh, how did we our brains actually develop? Was it tied to cooking food? Was it tied to eating meat? I don't know. But in modern diets, with how like every bread product and every cereal product is fortified with vitamins and minerals, and with how much protein there is in pretty much every vegetable, plant product, nuts, legumes, etc., almost nobody has a like serious protein deficiency in our country in the modern, yeah, in modern developed countries. So I would say, yeah, people, if you're trying to be more plant-based, don't worry too much about protein unless you have a specific health reason to do so. And also, yeah, just be creative. I feel like a lot of people get a little bit too much like, oh man, I'm just going to be eating like raw tofu and carrots. It's like, no,
yeah,
there's so much stuff out there to eat. Like, I'm never bored of the options. And yeah, there's like a new plant-based cookbook popping up like almost every day. You can find a cookbook or a restaurant that has plant-based options in basically every type of worldwide cuisine. And yeah, the creativity of it is amazing. But I feel like I went on kind of a journey when I, yeah, first went. plant-based to when I first, yeah, went plant-based, vegan. I tend to use those terms interchangeably. Some people get up in arms about like one being a diet, one being a like ethical stance, but I think yeah, I think there's room for lots of room for both of those things. But
Yeah,
yeah, when I first went vegan, I was, eating a lot of Beyond and Impossible burgers and trying to replicate my diet from before. But yeah, like there's a place for that, but then like my partner and I started making like all these really interesting marinated tempeh dishes that were like flavor combinations I'd never even attempted before. So
yeah,
yeah, I'd say just be creative and yeah, don't be afraid to ask around and explore. Explore a bit.
yeah. And I'll end it with two comments of my own here. So my dad is a vegan, and my mom has been a vegetarian since the 80s, and they both have tried to figure out the best way to go about that and to continue to make sure everything is copacetic and that you're healthy. Um, Two things that I really always want to comment on is when I went fully vegetarian for about 2 years coming out of college. I eventually had a doctor's appointment where they drew some blood from me and they realized I was B12 deficient. So if you're
Mm,
considering changing to a vegan or vegetarian diet, definitely look into supplements for vitamin B12. That's definitely important. And then the second thing here I wanted to plug in is that talking about protein, right, and how protein is so important to any diet in America, and also at the same time, it's not in so many other countries. If you're really worried about your protein intake or you need it for some sort of a health reason, I want to be maybe the first person to tell you that beans and rice make a perfect protein actually, and so does quinoa by itself. Actually,
mhm.
quinoa is a
Yeah.
perfect protein. So you can get that protein from other places that are not animal based. So that is a
Oh yeah.
an option that totally exists. Um, and finally, if you're interested in this, if you're inspired by this, and you want to learn more about this, there is a fantastic book written by Michael Grieger, or maybe he calls it Gregor.
Yeah.
But How
I've heard.
Not to Die. How Not to
Yes.
Die is a phenomenal book, and highly recommend reading it. We'll also link that in the description below. But yeah, Anne, thank you so much. This was
Yeah,
really
thank you.
great, and yeah, really, yeah, just hope to keep this going. And um, yeah, thanks everybody.